The year is 1942, and the third-floor briefing room at RAF Bomber Command feels like a morgue. Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris stares at a reconnaissance photograph of the French coast, but he isn't looking at a city, he's looking at a monster. Stretching from the fjords of Norway to the sun-scorched dunes of Spain, Hitler's Atlantic Wall has become a geometrical nightmare of reinforced concrete. The crown jewels of this defensive crust are the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire and Lorient, colossal monoliths protected by roofs 20 feet thick, woven with enough rebar to withstand a direct meteor strike. Every night, Harris sends his best crews into the flak alleys of occupied Europe, dumping thousands of tons of high explosives, including the massive 4,000-pound blockbusters. The result? Pure tactical humiliation. Aerial photos taken the morning after a 100-ton raid showed German sailors simply sweeping dust and debris off the pristine concrete roofs while their submarines slide into the Atlantic completely untouched. To the British military establishment, these structures have become invulnerable. The physics of traditional bombing has hit a literal wall. When a standard bomb strikes that slab of German engineering, 92% of the explosive energy dissipates harmlessly into the atmosphere, creating a flash of light and a loud noise, but leaving the structure below as silent and deadly as a tomb. The experts have reached a unanimous, soul-crushing verdict. Fortress Europe cannot be cracked from the sky, and any further attempt is merely sending young men to their deaths for the sake of an expensive fireworks show. The strategic paralysis is absolute. While the RAF blunts its teeth against the concrete, the gray wolves of the German U-boat fleet are strangling Britain, sinking 400,000 tons of Allied shipping every single month. Churchill's advisors are whispering about the unthinkable, a ground assault on these fortifications that could cost 40,000 casualties for a single base. The war is being lost not on the battlefield, but in the laboratory of physics where the Allies have no answer. Harris writes to Churchill with a bitterness that defines the era, noting that their bombs are bouncing off German roofs like tennis balls. The concrete deadlock has turned the strategic bombing campaign into a farce, and the Air Ministry is prepared to abandon the effort entirely to focus on a grinding, genocidal stalemate on land. But while the greatest scientific minds in Oxford and Cambridge are calculating the impossibility of penetration, a 54-year-old man with no university degree is standing in a quiet garden in Surrey, ignoring the sirens of the Blitz. Barnes Wallis isn't looking at the sky. He's looking at a bucket of water and a handful of children's marbles. The shocking twist that history almost ignored? Wallis isn't trying to figure out how to hit the concrete harder. He's realized that the concrete isn't the problem at all. The problem is the air. He concludes that to destroy the indestructible, he doesn't need a bigger explosion. He needs to turn the very earth itself into a weapon against the man who built upon it.
Effingham, Surrey, became convinced that their neighbor, Barnes Wallis, had finally suffered a mental collapse. Every evening, the 54-year-old assistant chief designer at Vickers Aviation could be found kneeling beside a long water tank in his backyard, his wire-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose as he flicked children's marbles across the surface with obsessive precision. To the casual observer, this was a man regressing into childhood, but to Wallis, this was a laboratory where the laws of physics were being rewritten. Born into a family of genteel poverty and forced to leave school at 17, Wallis was a man without the prestigious Oxford or Cambridge credentials that defined the British elite. He had spent 15 years as a shipyard apprentice, getting his hands dirty in the machine shops of Blackheath, and only earned his engineering degree at the age of 35 through a grueling night school program. This lack of formal indoctrination gave him a dangerous advantage. He didn't know what was impossible. While the Air Ministry's top scientists were trying to brute force their way through German concrete, Wallis was watching his daughter skip stones across a pond, noticing how the water didn't just absorb the impact, it conducted the energy. Wallis's backyard experiments were born from a radical realization that contradicted every military manual in existence. He theorized that if a projectile could be made to skip not just across water, but through the very fabric of the earth, it could bypass the hardened roof of a bunker entirely. He was obsessed with the idea of kinetic energy transfer, the way a shock wave travels through a solid medium like a bell ringing from within. His neighbors saw a madman playing with toys, but Wallis was recording the propagation of waves in his notebooks, calculating the exact angle and velocity needed to turn a bomb into a man-made earthquake. His wife, Molly, watched from the kitchen window with growing concern as her husband spent his nights skipping marbles of different weights and densities, trying to prove that a 10-ton steel dart could punch through 60 feet of rock if it hit the ground at supersonic speeds. The unexpected twist that would soon shock the ministry. Wallis wasn't just a theorist. He was the man who had already designed the Wellington bomber, a plane that stayed in the air even when half its frame was blown away because of its revolutionary geodetic structure. He had a track record of building the impossible, and as he flicked his last marble that evening, he realized he didn't need the Air Ministry's permission to be right. He only needed to prove that a marble could do what a 1,000-pound bomb could not.
By April 1942, the air inside Barnes Wallis's makeshift Special Projects workshop at Vickers Weybridge was thick with the scent of ozone and tobacco. The transition from backyard marbles to industrial physics led him to a conclusion so radical it bordered on heresy in the world of ballistics. Wallis realized that every military engineer in history was failing because they were obsessed with the hit, the moment of impact against concrete. He concluded that air is the enemy of destruction. It is a sponge that soaks up explosive energy, allowing 92% of a blast to simply vanish into the sky. To destroy a U-boat pen or a mountain tunnel, the bomb had to stop acting like a hammer and start acting like a needle. He envisioned a weapon that wouldn't explode on the target, but in the medium surrounding it. By streamlining a massive steel casing to reach supersonic speeds in freefall, the bomb would bypass the invulnerable roof entirely, burrowing deep into the geological foundation. This was the birth of the earthquake theory, a deep underground detonation that would send a shock wave through the solid earth, moving like a localized seismic vent. Instead of scratching the surface, the blast would create a massive underground cavity, a camouflage, causing the entire structure above to lose its footing and collapse under its own weight. The madness of the idea lay in the numbers Wallis was scribbling in his notebooks. To achieve this earthquake effect, he calculated he needed a 10-ton monster dropped from 40,000 feet, an altitude where the air was too thin for any existing Allied bomber to breathe. When he shared these figures with his colleagues, the reaction was immediate ridicule. They pointed out that a bomb of that size would be heavier than most fighter planes, and dropping it would likely cause the aircraft to flip or stall instantly. But Wallis, the self-taught engineer who understood the lattice strength of his Wellington bombers, saw the sky differently. He wasn't just designing a bomb, he was designing a specialized delivery system that used gravity as a propellant. He spent hours filming scaled-down models hitting simulated targets at the Road Research Laboratory, proving that his streamlined penetrators could punch deep holes without their casings rupturing. The unexpected twist that left his supervisors speechless? Wallis discovered that if the bomb hit the ground at precisely Mach 1, the Earth would briefly behave like a liquid, allowing the steel dart to swim through 60 feet of solid soil before the fuse even flickered to life.
He had found the back door to Hitler's fortress, but to open it, he would have to convince the Air Ministry that his toys were more lethal than their entire arsenal. On July 15, 1942, the atmosphere inside the Air Ministry's oak-paneled conference room in London was thick with condescension. Barnes Wallis, clutching his worn notebooks and film reels, stood before a phalanx of 11 senior officials and properly credentialed scientists from Oxford and Cambridge. To these men, Wallis was an interloper, an assistant designer who played with marbles while they managed a global war. As Wallis finished his presentation proposing an entirely new class of 10-ton supersonic weapons and a specialized bomber to carry them, the room fell to a deafening silence. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal broke it with a voice dripping with incredulity, asking if Wallis seriously expected Britain to divert its precious aluminum and engineering talent away from proven weapons to build a bomb based on garden experiments. Group Captain David Pye, the director of scientific research, was even more blunt, suggesting that Wallis's lack of a formal university degree had left him with a breathtaking misunderstanding of practical military engineering. They mocked the proposal as a fantasy, with one official joking that they might as well try to build bombers out of cheese. They were ready to dismiss him as a dangerous delusional, a man whose toys were a distraction from the hundreds of conventional aircraft they believed could eventually overwhelm Hitler through sheer numbers. However, the tide turned when the man who actually had to fight the war spoke up. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, the ruthless commander of Bomber Command, had been brooding in silence. Harris was a man of cold mathematics. He knew that sending 800 bombers to do a job they were physically incapable of was not a strategy, but a massacre. He cut through the academic bickering like a blade, silencing the room by stating he didn't care if the weapon was tested with children's toys as long as it worked. Harris recognized that the scientific consensus had yielded a 4% success rate and a mountain of dead airmen. While the bureaucrats feared a waste of resources, Harris feared a waste of lives. He looked at Wallis, not at his lack of a degree, but at the conviction in his eyes, and demanded to know if this earthquake bomb could be scaled down to fit a modified Lancaster. The unexpected twist? Faced with the terrifying pressure of the bomber himself, the ministry didn't give Wallis the 10-ton Grand Slam he wanted or the high-altitude bomber he needed. Instead, they gave him a poisoned chalice, a 3-month deadline, and limited resources to build a 6-ton prototype called Tallboy. If it failed, the ministry made it clear that Wallis would be held personally responsible for every resource diverted and every man lost in the pursuit of his impossible theory. On the night of June 8, 1944, just 2 days after the D-Day landings, the theoretical marvels of Barnes Wallis finally met the cold reality of the French landscape. The target was the Saumur railway tunnel in the Loire Valley, a vital artery through which German panzer divisions were rushing toward the Normandy beaches to crush the Allied foothold. For 18 months, conventional bombing had failed to even scratch this subterranean stronghold, protected as it was by 60 feet of solid rock. As 19 Lancasters of the elite 617 Dambusters Squadron crossed the coast, Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire dove his Mosquito to a suicidal 300 feet to mark the entrance with surgical precision. Above him, at 18,000 feet, Squadron Leader James Willie Tate centered his sights on the glowing red markers. In the belly of his modified Lancaster hung the first combat-ready Tallboy, a 21-foot aerodynamic masterpiece of hardened steel. When the release lever was pulled, the 6-ton dart vanished into the darkness, its offset fins causing it to spin like a rifle bullet for stability. Within seconds, gravity accelerated the weapon past the sound barrier. It didn't explode on the hillside, it vanished into it, punching through 60 feet of earth and rock before the delayed action fuse finally triggered. The result was a geological nightmare that rewrote the rules of warfare. The shockwave didn't dissipate into the air, it traveled through the bedrock like a thunderclap through water, causing the tunnel to collapse from within, as if the earth itself had decided to swallow the German tracks. A 300-foot section of the tunnel vanished, buried under 10,000 tons of fractured rock. When German engineers arrived the next morning, they didn't find a crater to fill. They found a mountain that had been rearranged, making the rail line unusable for weeks and forcing the panzer reinforcements into a slow, exposed march under the guns of Allied fighters. Wallis's stupid experiments had achieved in a single strike what thousands of conventional bombs could not. However, the unexpected twist came during the post-mission analysis of the reconnaissance photos. Intelligence officers noticed that the tall boy hadn't just destroyed the tunnel, it had created a crater 80 feet deep and 100 feet wide, proving that the bomb had penetrated nearly 70 feet of soil before detonating, nearly 10 feet deeper than even Wallis had predicted. The madman's theory was not just correct, it was more lethal than his own calculations had dared to suggest, turning the very foundation of Hitler's Fortress Europe into its greatest structural weakness.
By late 1944, the German battleship Tirpitz had become a ghost that haunted the British Admiralty. This 42,000-ton Leviathan, known as the Lonely Queen of the North, sat anchored in the deep Norwegian fjords, tied down by massive anti-torpedo nets and protected by the sheer vertical walls of the mountains. For 3 years, the British had thrown everything at it: midget submarines, carrier-borne fire raids, and dozens of conventional bombing missions. Every attempt failed. The ship's armored deck was a masterpiece of Krupp steel, designed to shrug off 1,000-pound explosives like rain. However, after the success at the Samur Tunnel, Barnes Wallis knew his steel needles were the only weapons capable of ending the battleship's reign. On November 12, 1944, 32 Lancasters from 9 and 617 squadrons rose from Scottish airfields, their bomb bays modified to carry the massive tallboys. As they crested the mountains above Tromsø, the Tirpitz opened fire with its 15-inch main battery, creating a wall of flak that shook the aircraft. But at 14,000 feet, Flying Officer Arthur Joplin centered his stabilized SABS sight. He wasn't aiming for the ship's side, he was aiming for the very center of its spine. The impact was a brutal validation of the earthquake theory. 2 tallboys struck the battleship with supersonic force. One penetrated the armored deck in midships, tearing through the engine room and detonating deep within the hull, while a second hit near the forward turret. The sheer kinetic energy of the 12,000-pound projectiles, combined with the delayed action Torpex explosion, did what 3 years of conventional warfare could not. It physically broke the ship's back. Within minutes, the Tirpitz began a slow, majestic roll to port. The unexpected twist, it wasn't just the direct hits that killed the battleship, it was the near misses that Wallis had predicted. One tallboy struck the seabed immediately adjacent to the hull, creating an enormous underwater cavity that vanished in a fraction of a second, causing the ship to lose its buoyancy and capsize. 950 German sailors were lost as the pride of the Kriegsmarine turned turtle in the shallow waters of the fjord. With the Tirpitz gone, the Arctic convoys were finally safe, and Hitler's surface fleet effectively ceased to exist. Barnes Wallis had proved that against his seismic weapons, even the thickest armor in the world was nothing more than a brittle shell. By early 1945, the tall boy had already shattered the myth of German invulnerability, but Barnes Wallis was not finished. He returned to his original, most ambitious vision, a weapon so massive it would make the tall boy look like a practice round. This was the Grand Slam, a 10-ton, 22,000-pound steel behemoth that pushed the boundaries of aeronautical engineering to the breaking point. It was 26 feet of aerodynamic perfection, cast from a single piece of high-tensile steel that required an entire week to cool after being forged. The challenge wasn't just building it was carrying it. The Lancaster bomber, already modified for the tall boy, had to be stripped of its defensive turrets and armored plating just to get the Grand Slam off the ground. On March 14, 1945, squadron leader C.C. Calder banked his overloaded Lancaster toward the Bielefeld Viaduct in Germany. This massive concrete and stone artery had survived 3,000 tons of conventional bombs over months of raids, with the Germans repairing the surface craters faster than the RAF could create them. But Calder wasn't aiming for the tracks on top. He was aiming for the geological foundation beside the central pillars. As the Grand Slam dropped from 13,000 feet, it achieved a terminal velocity of Mach 1.2, screaming through the air like a meteor. It didn't strike the viaduct itself. It burrowed nearly 100 feet into the soft earth adjacent to the massive concrete supports. When the delayed fuse triggered, the result was a true man-made earthquake. The underground explosion created a massive void, and the shock waves fractured the surrounding bedrock, causing the entire viaduct to shudder and disintegrate as its foundation literally vanished. 7 spans of the indestructible bridge collapsed into the valley in a single strike. The unexpected twist? When British engineers inspected the site after the war, they discovered that the Grand Slam hadn't actually hit a single piece of the bridge's masonry. The stupid experiment with marbles had worked so perfectly that the earth itself had become the primary weapon, proving Colonel Joseph Wagner's later admission. Our entire defensive strategy became obsolete because you cannot defend against weapons that cause earthquakes. By the war's end, 41 Grand Slams were dropped, silencing V-weapon sites and bridges that had resisted years of traditional bombardment, effectively ending the Reich's ability to move its dying armies. On October 30th, 1979, the world lost a man who had fundamentally altered the physics of war. Yet Barnes Wallis died in the quiet town of Leatherhead without ever seeking the limelight of a national hero. His final years were marked by a profound, somber reflection on the cost of his genius. When the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors granted him £10,000 for his wartime innovations, a fortune at the time, Wallis did something that stunned the establishment. He refused to keep a single penny. He donated the entire sum to Christ's Hospital School to establish a fund for the children of RAF personnel who had never returned from the missions involving his weapons. He privately told his daughter Mary that the money felt like blood payment, a weight he could not carry while grieving for every airman who had died testing the limits of his earthquake bombs. Despite the accolades and his eventual knighthood, Wallis remained the humble shipyard apprentice at heart, a man who preferred the company of his notebooks to the banquets of the elite. He had saved an estimated 50,000 Allied lives by rendering Hitler's fortifications obsolete, yet he never forgot that his success was built on the courage of young men flying overloaded Lancasters into the heart of the Reich. The true testament to Wallis's backyard experiments with marbles lies in the cold, hard steel of the 21st century. The DNA of the tall boy and Grand Slam lives on in every modern bunker buster in the global arsenal. During the 1991 Gulf War, when the U.S. military needed to destroy Saddam Hussein's command bunkers buried deep beneath layers of concrete and earth, they didn't invent a new theory. They reached back to Wallis. The resulting GBU-28 used the same principle: a hardened steel penetrator, high mass, and supersonic velocity to burrow deep before detonation. Even the modern GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, MOP, a 30,000-pound Titan, is essentially a scaled-up version of the Grand Slam, utilizing the same seismic shockwave physics Wallis proved in his garden. The efficiency of his design remains staggering. In pure mathematical terms, one of Wallis's earthquake bombs replaced the payload capacity of approximately 224 conventional sorties. Today, as military planners choose precision penetration over carpet bombing, they are still following the blueprints of a man who was told he was dangerously delusional. Barnes Wallis proved that history isn't always made by those with the most credentials, but by those willing to look absurd while chasing a truth that everyone else calls impossible.